A Good Tip for Ghosts by Paul Jennings. Dad was scabbing around in the rubbish. Ugh, how embarrassing, said Pete. It's lucky there's no one else here to see us. He looked around the tip. He was right. No one was dumping rubbish except us. There was just Dad, me, and my twin brother Pete. The man driving the bulldozer didn't count. He was probably used to people coming to the tip with junk and then taking a whole pile of stuff back home. It was a huge tip with a large muddy pond in the middle. I noticed a steer's skull on a post in the water. There were flies everywhere, buzzing and crawling over the disgusting piles. Thousands of seagulls were following the bulldozer, looking for rotten bits of food. "These country tips are fantastic," yelled Dad. "Come, help me get this." He was trying to dig out an old pram. I looked around and groaned. Another car had just pulled up, with a real flash one, Mercedes. We'd just arrived in Ellinsford the day before. It was a little country town where everybody knew what was going on. Pete and I had to start at a new school the next day. The last thing we wanted was someone to see us digging around in the tip. A man and a boy got out of the Mercedes. They had a neat little bag of rubbish which the man dropped onto the ground. A cloud of flies rose into the air. "Let's get out of here," the man said to the boy. "This place stinks." The boy was about my age, but he was twice as big as me. He had red hair and he looked tough. I could see he was grinning his head off and staring at our car. The back seat of our old bomb was full of Dad's findings. There was a mangled typewriter, a baseball bat, 2 broken chairs, a torn picture of a green lady lying on a tree branch, and a bike with no wheels. I blushed. Dad could just not go to the tip without taking half of it back home with him. I looked up at the kid with red hair again. He was pointing at Dad and laughing. "Oh no," Pete groaned. "Look what he's got now." Dad had run over to the bulldozer and held up his hand to stop the driver. He was digging around in front of its blade. He found an arm sticking out of the junk. It looked like a human arm, but it wasn't. It was the arm of one of those shop dummies they put dresses on. Dad pulled and yelled and jiggled until he got the whole thing out. Then he stood there, holding it up for all the world to see. A female shop dummy with no clothes on. It had a wig for hair, but apart from that it was stark naked. Its left arm pointed up at the sky. It looked like Dad was standing there with a naked woman. The red-haired kid and his father were both laughing by now. The boy bent down and picked up something from the ground. Then they got into their Mercedes and disappeared through the gate. Pete and I hung our heads with shame. We couldn't bring ourselves to look as Dad dragged the dummy back to the car. I hoped like anything that the red-haired kid didn't go to Ellinsford School. "Wonderful!" hooted Dad as he examined the shop dummy. "Your mother will be pleased. She can use this for making dresses." "Oh, don't give me that," said Pete. "You promised Mum you wouldn't bring anything back from the tip." Dad looked a bit sheepish. "But this is different, boys. This isn't junk, this is valuable stuff. Now give me a hand to get this dummy into the car." "Oh, not me," I said. "Nor me," said Pete. "I ain't touching her. She hasn't got any clothes on. That's rude." There was no room in the back of the car, so Dad sat her up the front. He put the seatbelt on her to stop her falling over. Her lifted arm poked through the rust hole in the roof. "Where are we supposed to sit?" I asked. "There's no room in the back." "One on each side of her," said Dad. "We'll all sit in the front. There's plenty of room." So that's how we went home. Shame. Oh, terrible shame. Driving along the road with a naked dummy sitting between us. Every time we passed someone, Pete and I ducked down so they couldn't see. Dad just laughed. It was all right for him. He wasn't starting at a new school in the morning. Then it happened. Blue light flashing. A siren. A loud voice saying, "Driver, pull over." It was the police. Policeman got off his motorbike and walked slowly to the car, pulled off his gloves and adjusted his sunglasses. Then he leaned in the window. "What's this naked lady?" He started off in a cross voice. Then he started laughing. He doubled up, holding his side and pointing to the dummy. "We had a report there was a naked woman," he said. He managed to get out in between gasps. "But it's only a shop dummy." I thought he was never going to stop laughing, but finally he said, "Where'd you get all this stuff, sir?" "The Ellinsford Tip," answered Dad. "The locals call it Haunted Tip," said the policeman with a grin. He seemed to want to stay and talk. He was probably trying to figure out Dad was a nutcase or not. Pete and I just sat there, trying not to be seen. "No one will go there after dark," he told us. "They say the ghost of Old Man Chompers works the tip at night." "Old Man Chompers, eh?" said Dad. "Yeah, he was the caretaker of the tip long ago. They say he was minding his 2 grandchildren there one day. The children disappeared and were never found. The ground collapsed and all the rubbish fell into a huge hole. People think the children were buried under piles of rubbish. Their bodies were never discovered because the hole filled up with water and formed a lake. Not long after, Old Man Chompers died. People say they've seen him walking the tip at night. He pokes at the rubbish, turning things over. I reckon he's looking for his lost grandchildren. He moans and calls out for the lost darlings. I shivered and looked at Pete. "You won't catch me going to that tip again," I said. "Good," said the policeman. "It's a dangerous spot. No place for kids. Anyway, it's said that Old Man Chompers can't leave the tip until he finds his darlings. He has to stay there until he finds them. That's why he wanders the lonely tip at night. He might think you two would do instead, if he caught you there." Then he said something that made my knees wobble. His grandchildren were twins, and Old Man Chompers had poor eyesight. "He might mistake you boys for his lost grandchildren." The policeman looked at us straight in the eyes, then turned and walked off, chuckling as he went. The next day, Pete and I started at Allansford School. It was even worse than we thought. The red-haired kid was waiting at the gate with his tough mates. "Here they are!" he yelled with glee. "The twins from the tip!" In a loud voice he started to tell everyone about Dad and the naked shop dummy. Pete and I looked at each other helplessly. We couldn't deny the story. It was true. I could feel tears starting to form behind my eyes. I had to stop them escaping, so I blinked real hard. I noticed Pete was doing the same thing. It's bad enough starting at a new school at the best of times, but when you have to live down something like that, it's just terrible. Fortunately, the bell went and we had to go inside. At recess time, though, it was even worse. "I'm top dog here," said the red-haired boy. His name was James Gribble. He pushed Pete in the chest. "What's your name, kid?" he asked roughly. "Pete?" Gribble gave a twisted grin. "This twin is Pete, so this one," he said, pointing at me, "must be Repeat. Pete and Repeat, the scabby twins from the tip." All the kids started to laugh. Some of them weren't laughing too loudly, though. I could see they didn't like Gribble much, but they were too scared of him to do anything. After the laughter died down, Gribble went and fetched a shoebox with a small hole in the end. "I'm the boss here," he said. "Every new kid has to take my nerve test. If you pass the nerve test, you're okay. If you won't do it, I'll thump you every day until you do." He held up a clenched fist. All the kids crowded around to see what would happen. The shoebox had a lid which was tied on with string. Gribble pushed the box into my hand. "Seeing as you like the tip so much, Repeat," he leered, "I've brought something back from there for you. One of you two has to have enough nerve to put your hand in there, take out the mystery object that I've found in the tip." Pete and I looked at the hole in the box. There was just enough room to put a hand inside. "Go on," said Gribble, "or you'll get your first thump." Don't mind telling you, I was scared. There was something in the box from the tip. Could be anything. A dead rat, or even worse, a live rat. Maybe a loaded mousetrap. My mind thought of the most terrible things. I didn't want to do it. Then I noticed one of the kids was nodding to me. A little kid with a kind face. He seemed to be telling me it was okay. I looked at Gribble. I've always heard that you should fight a bully if they first pick on you. Then if you fight hard and hurt them, they'll leave you alone. Even if you lose the fight, everyone will respect you and it'll be okay. I sighed. Gribble was twice as big as Pete and me put together. And he had tough mates. They'd wipe the floor with both of us. Things like teaching the bully a lesson only happened on TV. Slowly, I pushed my hand into the box. At first I couldn't feel anything. Then I touched something hard and slimy. It was sort of horseshoe-shaped. I shivered. It was revolting. There were rows of little sharp-pointed things. Then I felt another one the same. There were 2 of them. They reminded me of a broken rabbit trap. They felt like they were made of plastic covered in dry mould. I didn't have the faintest idea what I was holding. It had all sorts of horrible things come into my mind. Slowly I pulled my hand out and looked. It was a set of old, broken, false teeth. They were chipped and cracked and stained brown. They felt yuck, but I smiled at the circle of kids around me. Pete was grinning too. I had passed the nerve test, or so I thought. "Okay, Repeat," said Gribble with a horrible leer. "You've passed the first bit of the test." My heart sank. So did Pete's. I didn't realise there was going to be something else. Gribble pushed his face up against mine. He had bad breath. "Now, boys," he growled, "you have to take the false teeth back from where they came from. Back to the tip. He paused. Then he added, "At night." Pete and I looked at each other. Goosebumps ran up and down our arms. Before we could say anything, Gribble told us the next bit. "And just to be sure that you really go, you don't just pretend to go, you have to bring something back with you. You have to bring back the steer's skull in the middle of the tip pond. By tomorrow morning. You have to prove that you went to the tip at night by bringing back the skull." Pete and I spent the rest of the day worrying. We couldn't concentrate on our schoolwork. I got 2 out of 20 for my maths. Pete got 4 out of 20. The teacher must have thought that the new kids were real dumb. That afternoon, the boy who had nodded at me in the yard passed me a note. It said, "You better get the skull. Gribble is real mean. He punched me every day for a month until I passed his rotten nerve test. Signed, your friend Tony." I passed the note on to Pete. He didn't say anything, but he didn't look too good. After school, we walked sadly out of the gate. As we went, Gribble yelled at us, "Have a nice night, darlings." Neither of us could eat any tea that night. Mum looked at us in a funny way, but she didn't say anything. She just thought we were suffering from nerves about new school. She was right, but only partly. We were also thinking about the ghost of Old Man Chompers and his lonely search for his lost darlings. I looked at Pete and he looked at me. It was like staring in a mirror. It reminded me that Old Man Chompers lost his grandchildren, who were twins too. "Oh, we could pretend to be sick tomorrow," I said to Pete after tea. "Nah, wouldn't work," he answered. "Mum never gets fooled by that one. Anyway, we'd have to go back to school sooner or later. We could tell Dad and "Oh, sure," put in Pete before I could finish. "And he'll tell the teachers, and everyone in school will call us dobbers." "What about throwing the false teeth in the bin and getting a steer skull from somewhere else?" I said. "Gribble would know that we hadn't really been to the tip." Pete looked at me as if I was a bit crazy. "Great," he answered in a cross voice. "And where are you going to get a steer's skull at this time of night? Can't be any old steer's skull, you know. Has to have 2 white horns and horrible teeth. Nah, we'll have to do it. Have to take the false teeth back to the tip and bring back the steer's skull with us. There's nothing to be scared of. Ghosts aren't real. They aren't any ghosts. People just think them. They see them when they're scared." I nodded my head without saying anything. I was scared already. I didn't want to think that I saw a ghost, but I knew Pete was right. We would have to go. It was the only way. That night, after Mum and Dad had gone to bed, we snuck out the window and headed off for the tip. We walked slowly along the dusty road that wound through moonlit paddocks. Pete carried a rope with a hook on the end for getting the skull out of the middle of the pond. I carried a torch in one hand and false teeth in the other. They felt all slimy and horrible. I sure was looking forward to getting rid of them. There was not a soul to be seen. The crickets were chirping their heads off, and now and then an owl would hoot. Cows sat silently in the dry grass on the other side of the barbed wire fence. I was real scared, but for some reason the cows made me feel a little bit better. I didn't know why this was, because if anything happened, the cows weren't going to help. Cow's just a cow. The further we got from home, the more my knees started to wobble. I kept thinking that every shadow hid something evil and terrible. The inside of my stomach wall felt like a frog was scribbling on it with 4 pencils. Our first problem started when we reached the tip. There had a high wire fence around it with barbed wire at the top, and the gates were locked. A gentle wind was blowing, and the papers stuck to the fence flapped inside. "How are we going to get in?" I asked Pete. Secretly, I was hoping we'd have to go home. "Climb over, I guess," he said. We threw over the rope with the hook on it and clambered up the high wire fence. The wire was saggy, and it started to sway from side to side with our weight. We ended up perched on the top, trying to get our legs over the barbed wire. Suddenly, the whole fence lurched, sending us crashing to the ground on the inside. The fence sprang back up again with the rope on the other side. "Ow! Oh man, that hurt!" I yelled. I rubbed my aching head. "Quiet!" whispered Pete fiercely. "You're making enough noise to wake the dead." His words sent a chill up my spine. "Wish you hadn't said that," I whispered back. Pete looked up at the fence. We were trapped inside. "We'll never get back over that," he said. Could tell he was thinking the same thing as me. What fools we were. What were we going to do in a lonely tip in the middle of the night? There was no one to help us. There was not another soul here. Or was there? A little way off, behind some old rusting car bodies, I thought I heard a noise. Pete was looking in the same direction. was too terrified to move. I wanted to run, but my legs just wouldn't work. I opened my mouth to scream, but nothing came out. Pete stood staring as if he was bolted to the ground. It was a rustling, tapping noise. It sounded like someone digging around in the junk, turning things over. It was coming in our direction. I just stood there, pretending to be a dead tree or a post. I wished the moon would go in and stop shining on my white face. The tapping grew louder. It was coming closer. And then we saw it, or him, or whatever it was, an old man with a battered hat. He was poking around on the ground with a bent stick. He was rustling in the rubbish. He came on slowly. He was limping. He was bent and seemed to be holding his old dirty trousers up with one hand. And he came towards us with a terrible shuffle. Pete and I both noticed at the same time. His feet weren't touching the ground. He was moving across the rubbish about 30 centimetres above the surface. It was the ghost of Old Man Chompers. We both screeched the same word at exactly the same moment. Run! And we did run. We tore through the waist-high rubbish, scrambling, screaming, scrabbling, not noticing the waves of silent rats slithering out of our way, not feeling the scratches of dumped junk, not daring to turn and snatch a stare at the horrible spectre who hobbled behind us. Finally, with bursting lungs, we crawled into the back of an old car. It had no doors or windows, so we crouched low, not breathing, not looking, not even hoping. Why had we come to this awful place? Fools, fools, fools. Suddenly we thought of Gribble and the steer's skull. The false teeth seemed stupid. I would have fought 1,000 Gribbles rather than be here, trapped in a tip with a ghost. I could feel Pete trembling beside me. I could hear the voice of someone else, a creaking, croaking cry. My darlings, my darlings, my darlings, my darlings. I knew it, just knew it. Ghost of Old Man Chompers had seen us. He thought that we were his lost darlings, his dead grandchildren. He was coming to get us. Then he'd be able to leave this place, and take us with him, to that great ghost tip in the sky. I thought of Mum and Dad. I thought of my nice warm bed. I'd never see it again. Our parents would never know what happened to us, never know that we had come to our end on the bowels of the Allensford tip. At last, my darlings, at last! The wailing voice was nearby. He knew where we were. Without a word, we bolted out of the car. We fled blindly across the festering tip until we reached the pond, the deep black pond, filled with floating foulness. And behind, slowly hobbling above the bile, came the searching figure of old Chompers. We were trapped against the edge of the pond. In panic, we looked around for escape. Mountains of junk loomed over us on either side. To the back was the pond, and to the front, we dared not look. Quick! Yelled Pete. Help me with this! He was pulling an old rusty bath, dragging it towards the water. That won't float, I gasped. Look at the plug hole. The water will get in. It'll sink. Pete bent down, scratched a dollop of wet clay from the edge of the water, jammed it into the plug hole. Come on, he panted. Hurry! The bath was heavy, but terror made us strong. We launched it into the murky water. Then we scrambled in, just in time. The bath rocked dangerously from side to side, but slowly it floated away from the approaching horror. We paddled frantically with our hands until the bath reached the middle of the pond. Then we stopped and stared at old Chompers. He hobbled to the edge of the water, staggered towards us. He was walking on the water, his hands outstretched. My darlings, he groaned. My long-lost darlings. Pete and I clung to the sides of the bath with frozen fingers. The moon went in. Everything was black. Suddenly there was a pop. The clay plug shot into the air, followed by a spout of water. Brown wetness swirled in the bath. We were sinking. In a flash we found ourselves swimming in the filthy water. We both headed for shore, splashing and shouting and struggling. Pete was a better swimmer than me. He disappeared into the gloom. My jumper, soaked up with water, dragged me down. I went under. I came up again, and I spat out the lumpy brown liquid. I knew I'd drown unless I could find something to grab onto. The bath was gone. Then my hand touched something. It was a post with something on the end. I grabbed onto it and kicked towards the shore. And as my feet touched the bottom, I realized the post had horns. Then I saw that it had a face, a staring face with sharp teeth. It was the horrible, leering steer skull. I screamed and crawled over to where Pete lay on the shore. We were both soaked to the skin. We were cold and exhausted, but we were too tired to move. The ghost of Old Man Chompers crept across the water with outstretched hands. His face was wrinkled like a bowl of hard, cold custard. His mouth was a black hole, formed in the custard by a vanished golf ball. He chuckled as he looked at me. In my left hand I still had the false teeth. All the time I'd been running I'd held onto them. I had no other weapon, so I held them out in front of me. My fingers were shaking so much it made them chatter. As the ghost of Old Man Chompers jumped at me, I screamed, and I screamed and tried to push him off with the teeth. He grabbed the false teeth from my quivering fingers and shoved them into his mouth. "At last," he said, "I've found them, my darlings, my darlings." He opened and closed his mouth with joy, making sucking noises as he did it. After a bit of this, he pulled out a ghostly apple from his pocket and started to chomp on it. "Wonderful," he cackled, "wonderful. You don't know what it's like without my darlings. I owe you boys a big favour for bringing these back." We both lay there looking at the grinning ghost. Suddenly he didn't seem to be so scary. Pete found his voice at first. "You mean that your lost darlings are your false teeth, not long-lost grandchildren?" The ghost started to cackle even more. "Them," he said. "Them brats. What would I want them for? I told 'em not to play around here. Told 'em it was dangerous. No, I was looking for these." He smacked his lips again and showed the cracked brown teeth. "Couldn't leave without these. Been looking for them for years. Now I can go. Now I can leave this rotten dump and join all the others." As he said this, he started to fade away. I knew we'd never see him again. "Wait!" yelled Pete. "Don't go! Come back!" Chompers stopped fading and looked at me. "What?" he said. "What do you want?" I could see that he was in a hurry. He didn't want to hang around the tip for any longer than he had to. Pete looked at the ghost straight in the eye. "You said you owe us a big favour for bringing your teeth back. Well, we want to be paid back. We want one favour before you go." "Well," said old Chompers with a chirp smile. "What is it?" Old Chompers wasn't the only one who didn't want to hang around that tip. He showed us the hole in the fence, and we ran back down the road as fast as we could go. When we got back to Allensford, we climbed up a certain tree and looked in a certain window. Gribble was fast asleep in bed. He had a big smile on his face. He'd fallen asleep, thinking how smart he was, making those dumb twins go to the tip in the middle of the night. Suddenly he was awakened by a noise. It sounded like a person tapping with a stick. It was coming towards his window. Then he heard a croaky voice. "My darling," it said. "At last I found my darling." Gribble was terrified. He wanted to scream, but nothing would come out. A terrible figure floated through the wall. He had a face which was wrinkled like a bowl of hard, cold custard. His mouth was a black hole, formed in the custard by a vanishing golf ball. And in that black hole was a pair of cracked, old, false teeth. The ghost chuckled as he held the horrible skull over Gribble's head. "I think you want this," he said as he dropped his load on Gribble's face. "That was from Pete," he screeched. "And this," he yelled, picking it up again, "is a repeat." Gribble didn't feel the steer's skull the second time, nor did he see the ghost fade away. He had fainted. Next day at school, though, James Gribble was really nice to me and Pete. I'd never met a more polite boy, and there was one thing I could tell you for a fact. He never mentioned anything about being the top dog, ever again.